Welcome to the last of our recorded trainings, which is an introduction to intensive trial teaching. The learning objectives of this presentation. So we're going to look at what is intensive trial teaching, or ITT. What skills do we teach using ITT? How do you know what you should be teaching during an ITT session? We'll have a look at an example individualized education plan. We'll talk about mastered cards, what they are, what do the different colored cards mean, what do you do before you start an ITT session, and how you set your ITT table up. We're also going to have a look at how we start the ITT session. So what are the 3 steps that we use to start an ITT session? What do we mean when we say fading in demands? And how many demands should you place on a pupil? In terms of error correction then, we will very quickly run through this, but in terms of what we will cover in workshop style, error correction will primarily be covered in a workshop. So essentially what this is our procedure for when a pupil makes an error. We'll briefly talk about what's actually considered an error. And then in terms of what to teach, we'll very quickly go through baselining, probing and retention, but again, this will primarily be covered in workshop. And then our errorless teaching procedure will also be covered in a workshop, but we'll very kind of briefly go through it. We'll also talk about what is an SD, what's prompting, which we've covered in one of our previous presentations, reinforcement, and then inputting new skills. Okay, so what does ITT stand for then? So it stands for intensive trial teaching. So ITT has been demonstrated to be an effective method of treatment and education for individuals with autism. So the instructional method includes a teacher presenting instructional material in a very precise and sequenced manner so that it evokes frequent responses to the material by the learner. So it's a very structured, formal teaching environment. So our first ASR then, so what does ITT stand for? Is it intensive teacher training? Is it intensive table teaching? Or is it intensive trial teaching? And the answer is intensive trial teaching. In some other settings, it might be called DTT or discrete trial teaching. Okay, so what is ITT? So following each pupil response, the teacher presents a consequence that usually takes the form of some type of feedback about whether the response was correct or incorrect. So if the response is correct, it usually results in some suspected form of reinforcement to strengthen that correct response. Following incorrect responses, then the teacher, the tutor will provide feedback indicating that an error has occurred. And we usually conduct what we call our error correction procedure. And again, we'll very briefly go into what that is, but we won't go into it in too much detail over this recorded training. So the instructional demands should be in the form of presentation of verbal responses of the teacher. So it might be in the form of asking a pupil to tact something or to label something. So you might say, what is it? It could be a picture or an object or something like that. Touch your nose, so a receptive instruction. It could also be non-verbal stimuli. So it might be things like pictures or objects to match, or it might be some combination of both. So for example, you have a field of cards on the table, one of which is a picture of water, or a cup, sorry, and your instruction to the pupil is, tell me the one that you drink from, and they select the cup. So it might be a combination of both verbal responses and non-verbal stimuli. So correct responses usually result in a suspected form of what to strengthen the responses? Is it reinforcement, punishment, or extinction? And the answer is reinforcement. So as you'll remember in our earlier presentations, if we want to see a behavior occurring more often, if we want a behavior to increase or to strengthen, then we're going to provide reinforcement following that particular behavior or response. So then just briefly, what type of skills do we teach during ITT? So ITT instruction can be used to teach almost any kind of skill in any environment. But in this presentation, we're talking about teaching skills that are representative of the core deficits of individuals with autism. So the skills taught during ITT at an instructional table will usually include the following. So listener behavior. We also call listener behavior receptives. You'll often hear us talking about listener behavior as receptives. So essentially, it's giving an individual an instruction. Tacting then is labeling. Motor imitation is copying the motor movements of another person. So for example, I clap and then the pupil claps. Visual performance then can be things like matching or sorting. Interverbal behavior is responding to what another person says. So for some of the pupils, it might be something like simple fill-ins. So socks and the pupil says shoes. For some more kind of complex interverbal behavior, it might be, what do you use to cut? And the pupil might respond scissors. And echoic responses as well we teach during ITT. So echoing another person, echoing what another person has said. So how do you know what to teach in ITT? Well, each of the pupils at Snowflake has an individualized education plan. Okay, so the IEP lists all of the programs that should be currently taught for each of individual pupil. In the IEP, under the section setting, it specifies whether the program should be ran in ITT or in NET. Okay, so this is an example first page of one of our IEPs. So you can see here that we'll have the pupil name. As I said, each of the pupils has their own individualized education plan, which is specific to the assessments that have been carried out for them and is highly, highly individualized just for that pupil. In terms of the different sections then of the IEP, so we have here EHCP outcomes. So the EHCP stands for Education Healthcare Plan. Each of the pupils has an education healthcare plan. It's a legal document which essentially outlines the different goals that the school is legally obligated to work towards. So you will see in this section here in detail. Now, this is just an example, so it doesn't actually have a detailed goal here, but it will have detailed goals and what programs we're using to work towards that goal. So as I said, the EHCP is a very, very important document that shows what we're legally obligated to work on with the pupil. The second column here is for the individual programs that are in teaching. So if something is highlighted in yellow on the IEP, this means that it is currently in teaching. If it's simply typed on the IEP, but it's not highlighted yellow, that means it's a next up program. So we're not currently working on that program. The only programs we're working on currently is anything that's highlighted in yellow. Curriculum then, don't worry too much about this, but essentially it's talking about where this particular goal has come from. So in this case, one program is tacting objects or pictures. So that is labeling objects and labeling pictures. And this particular program goal comes from the VB map level 2 tacting. Okay. And here we've got our column which states the setting. So you can see here that the first setting that's written here is ITT. So that means that this particular program is primarily work done in ITT. The reason why there is it also says net beside it, means that we generalize those skills then into the natural environment. But if it says ITT first, it means that that program is primarily taught in intensive trial teaching. Our fifth column then here will just outline what kind of data we need to take, and we'll go into the data in our data collection training, which we do in person. And then graphing just says the associated graphs for this particular verbal operant area, so that you can see here that this is all of these goals are underneath TACTs. So they're all TACT programs. And then these are the different graphs. And again, we will go through that in person. So, what document contains information about all current programs that should be in teaching for a pupil? Is it A, individualized program plan, B, individual teaching plan, or C, individualized education plan? And the answer is individualized education plan. So you'll often hear us around school just calling it an IEP. So mastered cards then. So each pupil at Snowflake School will have a box filled with what we call mastered cards. So each individual card represents a skill which has previously been taught and the pupil has mastered. So when we say that they've mastered it, it means that they're able to consistently perform the skill without any prompting. So it's something that we've previously taught the pupil how to respond to. Okay, an example box of mastered cards we will show you in the workshop. So mastered cards are the skills that a pupil has previously mastered, the skills that are currently being taught, or are they the skills that are next up teaching targets? So the mastered cards are the skills that a pupil has previously mastered. So what do the different colored cards mean? So when you see the master cards, we will watch a video where we can have a quick look at this. But what do the different colored cards mean? So most pupils will have two different types of mastered cards. So we have what we call their picture cards. Okay, so they are simply pictures that are printed out, cut out, stuck on white cards. Okay, and these are generally tacts and receptives. So it means that the pupil can respond to that picture. Let's use this for an example. Say we've got flowers here. So if this was a pupil's picture card, mastered picture card, and we ask them, what is it? They would be able to respond flower. Okay. If it's mastered as a receptive, it means that we would be able to have the picture of the flower out on the table, and we would be able to say, can you show me the flower? Or where's the flower, touch the flower, point to the flower, etc. So they will be able to follow the instruction to identify the flower. Now it's really important to say that just because a picture card is in a pupil's mastered card pile, it doesn't mean that it's mastered as both a tact and a receptive. Some pupils will have a lot of cards that are mastered as receptives and not as many that are mastered as tacts. And some of them will have a lot of skills that are the opposite way around, maybe that a lot that are mastered as tacts and not as many as receptives. So it's really, really important that you check on the back of the card. This isn't an actual an actual ITT card, but you will check on the back of the card and it will indicate for you with little stickers whether it is mastered as a tact or a receptive. And we'll go through the colors of what those stickers will be in one of the next slides. Okay. It's also really important that we write pupil names on the mastered cards in case they go missing, and then we'll know which pupil they're mastered skill for. Most pupils will also have another type of mastered card, which we call their rainbow cards, okay? And these are different colored cards. These cards can represent tacts. Generally, the tacts will be tacts that don't involve a picture. So it might be something like, what's this? And the pupil will say nose. Or it might be something like, what am I doing? And the pupil will say clapping. Okay, so they're tacts, so they're labeling, but it's something that's not related to a picture. They also might have a card which represent what we call receptive instructions. So that might be something like, can you stand up? Or can you show me jumping? Something like that. So they're following an instruction. And again, it's following an instruction that's not related to a picture. Within the rainbow cards as well, they might also have some echoic skills that they've mastered. So for example, say flower, and the pupil says flower. They might have some intraverbal skills that they've mastered. What do you write with? And they say pen. And they also might have some motor imitation skills. So can you copy me? And then the pupil copies you. So these are the two types of mastered cards that the pupils will have: picture cards and rainbow cards. Okay, so when we're moving into what do the different colored cards mean? Well, each of the verbal operants is assigned a different color card. So this helps us to easily determine what verbal operant the skill is from and allows you to run your session with a fast pace. Okay, so if a card is in our rainbow pile and it is attacked within our rainbow pile, so remember that's our tacting things like actions, tacting body parts, so something that doesn't involve a picture, that's going to be on a green card. Same for receptive. So receptive is yellow. So again, these are receptives that are not to do with the picture. So these might be receptive instructions. So things like, can you show me clapping? Can you touch your head? That's some examples of some potential receptive targets. Intraverbals then will be on blue. Motor imitation is on pink. And just a white card is echoics. So just coming back to our rainbow cards then, or not our rainbow cards, sorry, our picture cards. In terms of whether a picture card is mastered as a tact or a receptive, it will have a colored sticker on the back. So if it's mastered as a tact, it will have a little green sticker on the back. If it's mastered as a receptive as well, it will have a yellow sticker. And if it's only mastered as one, it will just have one sticker, okay, depending, and it'll be green or yellow, depending on whether it's tact or receptive, okay? So that's how we know within our picture cards if the pupil has mastered this particular picture as a tact, a receptive, or both. Okay. So what we're going to do is quickly watch a little bit of a video of one of our pupils, the beginning of their ITT session. Okay, let's have a little watch of this.
Nice way Wow. Lovely.
Okay. Before we continue on with the video, you can see here that the tutor has two separate piles of cards on the table in front of them. The pile of cards to the left is the picture cards, and the pile of cards to the right is the rainbow cards. It doesn't have to be in that order. It's just important that you have two separate piles of cards. You can have them whichever side is more comfortable for you. You can then see that on the table in front of the pupil, she's placing what we call an array of cards, of the picture cards. We also call this our receptive field. So you'll be asking the pupil to identify the pictures from this field. So only picture cards, which are mastered as receptives, so picture cards which have a yellow sticker on the back, will be put in the receptive field. How many cards are in a receptive field varies between pupil and pupil. So for some pupils, they will have a receptive field of only 3 cards. For this pupil, he has a receptive field of actually 10 cards, which is quite a large array of cards that he needs to scan and also identify between. So your supervisor will be able to tell you what the receptive field of the particular pupil that you're working with is. Okay, so that's just a little example of what the ITT table might look like. So like I said, it will differ pupil by pupil in terms of how many cards are in your receptive field. But as a general, that's a very good example of what our ITT table should look like. These cards here are all mastered cards. So they're all skills which this pupil has learned how to respond to previously. What we'll do in our workshop is we'll do a quick fire practice of which verbal operant a card represents. So you get really comfortable with what the different colors are. So before we start an ITT session, then what do we want to do? Well, we want to make sure that the instructional area is organized. We need to make sure that we have all materials. So for example, we need our mastered cards and we also need our reinforcers. So we need all of these things ready to go. We also want to have our materials organized enough that someone else could come and teach our pupil if you were not with them, or perhaps if you were unwell that day and you weren't in school. So we need to have all of our materials nice and organized. Okay, so we've kind of gone through this already, but just a recap. So when running your ITT session, generally the master cards are set up in the same way for the majority of pupils. Picture cards pile, rainbow cards pile, receptive field. So the field number varies, as I said, for each pupil. Okay. So there's 3 steps then which you complete at the beginning of every single ITT session. So not just the first ITT session of the day, every single ITT session that you have in the day begins in the very same way. So the 3 steps that we're talking about are what we call our pairing and manding at the beginning of the session. And we'll go through what the 3 steps are, and we'll also have a little look at a video as well. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to give the pupil access to a variety of their preferred items. So we want to interact with the pupil with these items. We want to try and build motivation for the items. And essentially, we just want to make the items fun. So that's going to be the first thing that we do at the beginning of every single ITT session. So let's have a little look at another one of our pupils at the very beginning of his ITT session.
You need a cuddle before you go. Sometimes you need a big cuddle.
We've got the...
Ready for a cuddle?
He's coming for you!
You ready?
He's coming for you!
Standing on the
Oh no! Wow, he's giving a good press. Oh, this is cool. The spinner. 3, 2, 1, can you pause the iPad?
Okay, so that's a really nice example of the start of an ITT session where you're simply giving the pupil access to all of their preferred items for free. You're interacting with them with the items and you're trying to build motivation for the items. So you could see that the tutor was interacting with the toys, trying to build motivation for the different toys and trying to get the pupil interested in lots of different items. So that's our first step. Our second step then is going to be to begin to ask the pupil for the items back. So for some pupils, it might be that we need to swap one item out for another. So let's say, for example, using the only props that I have here, our pupil is playing with the highlighter, which is unlikely, but let's just say the pupil is playing with the highlighter, really happy to have the highlighter, and I say, oh wow, can I see the highlighter? Here, you can have the pen. So I swap one item out for another. So basically that means that the pupil is not left without reinforcement at the very beginning. So that might be necessary for some pupils. It also might not be necessary for other pupils. It might be that other pupils are going to happily give you the items, and at this point you're going to return the item to the pupil immediately to reinforce them giving the item to you. So in our second step, we ask the pupil for the items, but we give them straight back to them, because essentially what we want to do is reinforce that they're actually following our instructions, and we're just fading in our demands. We're placing really easy demands at the beginning. Okay, so let's move back to our other example here, and we're going to have a look at the first two steps for this particular pupil. So you can see here that the pupil has access to a variety of different items. He's got his iPad, he's got a spiky ball, he's also gets the crisp, he's got a spinner, bubbles, yeah. Okay, so that's a really nice example there of our step 2. Okay, so the pupil has the ball. In this particular pupil's program, it was individualized for him that he would be given a crisp when he successfully gave back his reinforcers within a certain number of seconds. Okay, so that's individualized for him, but not necessarily other pupils might not necessarily have that in their program. Obviously, it's very, very individualized. Okay, but you can see that he gave up access to the ball and then his tutor gave it back to him immediately. Okay, so that's our second step. And then our third step. So after the pupil is happily giving you access to their preferred items, we're going to begin to require them to mand for the items. So it's really important that the pupil mands for all items that they're motivated for. Okay, By manding for the item, it shows us that this item might act as a reinforcer during our session. So we're never going to deliver an item by itself that a pupil is not manded for during the session. Okay, so we're not going to be doing work and then give the pupil the highlighter when they never manded for the highlighter at the beginning of the session. Okay. During our third step, what we're trying to do is figure out what the most preferred items are for the pupil. So when the pupil is giving you access to the items and they're requesting them, it gives you an indication as to what the most preferred items are and what are the lesser preferred items. And in your head, what we need to start doing is making what we call a hierarchy of reinforcers. Okay, so what is their number one reinforcer, and then maybe what's their second preferred reinforcer, third preferred reinforcer, fourth preferred, etc., depending on how many reinforcers they're motivated for in the session. And the reason why it's important to do that is because we need to be able to what we call differentially reinforce during the session. So when a pupil is responding accurately to teaching targets without making any errors, then they're going to be getting access to all of their highest reinforcers. However, if they start engaging in problem behavior during an ITT session, we're still going to be giving access to a reinforcer, but it's going to be one of their lesser preferred reinforcers. So we're differentiating the reinforcement within the session. So that's really important. And you're able to do that, and you're able to create your hierarchy of reinforcers during your pairing and manding, and in particular during your third step of the pairing and manding process. So we'll go back to our video.
Ready? Should we spin it? You can have it, Christy, you just need to wait. Nice chocolates. Nice waiting. Adrian. Wow. Lovely. Goodness. Oh, you can't say. Good girl. I think I just give her first. There we go. Okay. Amazing job.
Okay, so we can see here that the pupil gives up access to his reinforcers really beautifully. And the first thing he mans for is crisp. Okay, so I can tell you just by knowing this pupil that his highest reinforcer is always going to be the crisps. It always was, because he's highly motivated for them. Okay, so that gives us an indication that that might be one of his highest reinforcers. Okay, so he could see then that what was available was the iPad and the ball, and he chose the ball, which gives us an indication that potentially the ball is more reinforcing than the iPad. His tutor then held up the ice pack and the iPad, and between these two, he chose the iPad, which gives us an indication that the iPad is more reinforcing than the ice pack.
Sure. Ready? Ready? Can you show Chrissy the ball? Wow, nice job. Chris, you can't have Chris right now, you just need to wait. Oh, sure. Ice pack, lovely asking.
Okay, so in this case, he gave up access to his preferred items, and then the first thing he manded for was the crisp, but he also had it in his program to try to wait for the crisp. So his tutor said, oh, you can't have the crisp right now, you just need to wait, and he manded for the ball. So between the ball and the iPad, again, we're assuming that the ball is more reinforcing, okay? And the reason why it's important to do the pairing and manding across the items numerous times at the start of the session is because it might be that although it seems like at first one thing is more motivating than the other, it's important for us to check a couple of times to just to make sure, okay?
Oh my goodness. Amazing job. That was lovely waiting for Chris. Wow. Much snuggle. Oh, nice asking.
Okay. So if we're going to place his items now in a hierarchy, let's try and think about what the first item would be. So what's the thing that he's been consistently manding for first? That would be the crisp, okay? After the crisp then, what is the next thing that he's been consistently requesting the most? That'd be the ball. And after that then, it would be the iPad. And after that, the ice pack, okay? So that's our hierarchy of reinforcers for this session. He wasn't super motivated for the spinning top. Okay. So that's kind of a little overview of how we would start the beginning of a session, an ITT session. And again, we'll go through this in the workshop and we'll actually role play it together. Okay, so this was what we'll do in the workshop. So we'll work on the 3 steps. Firstly, giving the items for free. Secondly, requiring the pupil to give up the items. And thirdly, requiring the pupil to mand for the items they're motivated for. Now, it might seem that this takes quite a long time, but actually, if you have a ITT session which is 30 minutes long, we would expect that those 3 steps, the pairing and manding process, take between 3 and 5 minutes out of the whole session. Okay. So after we've done our pairing and manding and we have our hierarchy of reinforcers, it's really important that we begin to fade our demands in slowly. So for example, the pupil gives up access to their preferred item and we run one mastered card. So for example, that might be, what is it? They say flower, and then we reinforce that response by delivering their preferred items back. Okay. Generally, we give access to a pupil, we give a pupil access to their preferred items for somewhere around 30 seconds is generally the length of time in reinforcement. That's if you're running a table session, a full table session where you're working on targets as well. At the beginning, when you're just beginning to work with a pupil and you're still pairing with them, they'll be in reinforcement for a lot longer than that. Okay, so next, the pupil gives up access to their preferred items, and then we run maybe between 2 and 3 mastered cards. So you see where we're going here, we're slowly fading in, and then we reinforce by delivering their preferred items back. And then again, pupil gives up access to their preferred items, and then maybe we run 4 or 5 master cards and we reinforce by delivering their preferred items back. So let's have a look at this in the video.
Amazing. Can you give me the word today? Oh my goodness, fantastic job. What can you say? Amazing, you can have your ice pack and you can have your iPad. she goes bing, 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 bing. Okay, Lucia, can you see? Oh, it's got a nice job. What can you see? So we're going to cheer. And can you give me your straw? Nice job. What's the boy doing? Lovely. And where's the pasta? Fantastic job. Lovely listening. That's your iPad. And you have your iPad.
So you can see here for this pupil, he actually was able to respond to quite a few demands at the table. That's why she placed more than one demand in the first, what we call the first batch of demands. So she placed 2 demands, then gave access to his reinforcement. Then she placed, I think it was around 5 demands and back into reinforcement again.
Oh no, only one if he gets it. Oh my goodness, might as well pause it. We have to wait anyway. Can I go to the iPad? Nice job. Can you give me the straw? Lovely job. Can you wave? Nice. Where's the sugar? Fantastic. Can you write with her?
Okay. Let's go back to our presentation. Okay, so that's fading in your demands. So, how many demands do you place on a pupil? So these are what we call our different reinforcement schedules, okay? We don't need to go into them in too much detail. I'll quickly run through them. The most important one that you need to know about is called the variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. So what the variable ratio means is that a pupil answers on average a certain number of demands before reinforcement. So say, for example, the pupil that you're working with has a VR of 5. That means that the pupil answers between 1 and 10 demands before reinforcement. And what we want is that the average comes out at 5. Okay. VR, you'll often hear us just referring it to VR as VR, is the most common schedule of reinforcement used for the pupils during ITT. So you'll hear us referring to that a lot. The other 3 schedules aren't used as often, so I'll really quickly run through them. Fixed ratio schedule then is that the pupil answers a fixed number of demands before reinforcement. So say, for example, if the pupil had a fixed ratio schedule of 1, the pupil answers 1 demand and then gets reinforcement. So like I said, very unlikely that you'll see this schedule of reinforcement. Variable interval then means that the pupil answers demands for an average of a certain amount of time. Okay, so interval is referring to time. So if a pupil has a variable interval schedule of 20 seconds, we would place demands for between 1 and 40 seconds, and we want the average to be at 20 seconds. Again, not as likely that you'll see the pupils on this type of schedule within ITT. Fixed interval then schedule is that the pupil answers demands for a very fixed amount of time. So if the pupil has a fixed interval schedule of 1 minute, then we would place demands for 1 minute, and after 1 minute we would deliver reinforcement. So as I said, the most important one for you to be familiar with from these is the variable ratio. Okay, so what do we consider an error? When we're talking about our mastered cards, what is an error? So we would consider obviously an incorrect response an error. So if we ask the pupil, what's this? And they say tree, that would be obviously an incorrect response. We consider that an error. We also consider no response an error. If there's a delay in responding of greater than 3 seconds, Now, for some pupils, it might be in their plan that you would give them a little bit longer than 3 seconds. It's very individualized, so you'll just have to check with your supervisor how much time you give the pupil to respond. And also we would consider scrolling through other responses and errors. So say, for example, we asked a pupil, what's this? And they said apple, tree, flower. So they scrolled through different responses. Even though they landed on the correct one, we would still consider that an error. Okay, so if a pupil does error, okay, what do we do? And this is our error correction procedure. Now, I'm not going to go through it, sorry, excuse me, in this training, but we will cover this in detail in a workshop. So what we'll do is we'll actually role play error correcting across the different verbal operands. But it's important for you to know that we have an error correction procedure. Okay. So generally in an ITT session, we'll teach 3 new skills per table session, mixed with mastered cards, okay? So we probe new skills. So we check at the beginning of the session if the pupil knows the skill or not. And then we do what we call errorless teaching 3 times. So if you have 3 targets, and each target you have to teach errorlessly 3 times, that means in total in your ITT session, you're going to have 9 errorless teaching trials. And again, don't worry too much about this because we'll go into what our errorless teaching procedure is in our workshop. This is just an example of the data sheet that we use in ITT. And again, we'll go through this in the workshop as we actually practice it in person. But just so you know that this is an example of what it actually looks like. Kind of similar to our data sheet that I showed you for natural environment teaching for our manding. Okay. All right. So when we're first introducing a skill, what we do is we baseline that skill. Okay, so this is a brand new target that you're introducing for this pupil. So what you're doing when you're baselining a skill is that you're checking basically to see if the pupil already knows it or not. So we baseline a skill by doing the following. So essentially in one session, you're going to test that skill 3 times without reinforcing the answer. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to ask the pupil whatever the skill is. So let's use our example of the flower again. So I'm going to say, and if it's attacked, I'm going to say, tell me what you see. I'm going to wait and see what they say. And even if they get it right or wrong, I'm not going to reinforce during our baseline. Okay, so we're checking to see if they know it or not. If the pupil gets it right 3 times, then it's something that they already know. Okay, so let's go back to our data sheet here. If we look at our target here, which is dress, this skill was baselined on the same day, and what the tutor will have done they will have had a picture of a dress, and 3 times they will have asked the pupil to label the picture, and on each of the 3 occasions the pupil got it right without us giving any indication as to if it was wrong or not or right. Okay. What we do then to signify that it was mastered on baseline is that we highlight it pink and we put a red line to signify mastery. Now, don't worry too much about this because we will actually go into detail on actually filling these sheets out more in our workshop. If any of our responses during the baseline was a no, then we will put the skill into teaching. Okay, it now becomes a target. So if you look here at our second example in this sheet here, The second example here was skirt. Okay, so the first time they asked the pupil to label the skirt, they actually got it right. So they said skirt. The next time they got it wrong, and then the third time they got it wrong. So even though they got it right once, we're still going to put this target into teaching. So we signify that the target goes into teaching by putting a black line here after our baseline. Now, like I said, we will do more practice of this. Okay, we're not going to go into the day-to-day data collection for the targets in this presentation, but we will be going through it in our workshop. This is what we call our errorless teaching procedure. So this is how we teach those skills that we've introduced as targets, okay? And again, we're going to go through this in our workshop. So we're coming up to then, what are some of the elements of a learning trial? So you'll sometimes hear us refer to something called an SD, which is a discriminative stimulus. So this is a demand, question, or directive that's given to evoke a specific response. So it basically means that it's some signal to the learner that reinforcement is available if they give the correct response. So some examples of SDs will be touch red, can you give me the ball? Can you clean your room? Touch your nose. So when running an ITT session, we want to vary the SDs. So for example, for the flower, I might say, what is it? What do you see? Tell me what's in the picture. And this one is so we're always varying our SDs. So we're not just constantly saying, what is it? What is it? What is it? We want the pupil to be able to respond to very natural kind of given instructions. And it's really important that when we're placing these demands during ITT, that we use a very kind of natural tone of voice and enthusiastic kind of way of a very clear, a very natural level of enthusiasm, so that it's more likely that in the natural environment, the pupil will be able to respond to the exact same instruction. Okay, prompting then. So this is a review of prompting, which we covered in our natural environment teaching presentation. So prompt then obviously is a form of assistance or cue given to help the learner complete a task. So FP or FPP is a full physical prompt, so that's a hand over hand prompt. Partial physical prompt then, or PPP, you're partially physically prompting, but it's not as intrusive as a full physical prompt. Gestural prompt, you might indicate that maybe you might point to something. Model prompt, you do it and the pupil copies you. Textual prompt, which is a written prompt. Verbal prompt then obviously is telling them. So a reinforcer then, a reinforcement. So a reinforcer is something used to motivate a learner to complete a task or engage in a behavior. So it could be a tangible, it could be a toy, social praise, maybe physical, like hugs. In behavior analytical terms, to be considered a reinforcer, the reinforcer must have reinforcing qualities. So, for example, basically, it will increase the likelihood of future occurrence of the target behavior under similar circumstances. So you will often hear us referring to a pupil's preferred items as their reinforcers. Okay, that's kind of just how we use the language day to day. But in order for something to actually be a reinforcer, it has to increase the future likelihood of a target behavior. So it's really important to remember that reinforcement is individual and ever changing. So it is our job that we're constantly trying to seek out and discover new reinforcers for the pupils that we're working with. So always important to try new things, try new toys. If you see another tutor with a really great toy or activity that you think your learner would really like, just ask them if you can borrow it, and we'll be able to get your learner one as well. Each of the pupils has a budget in terms of reinforcers for ITT sessions. Okay, so some key points then for reinforcement. So it's really important that we always deliver reinforcers immediately. It should be that the tutor controls the reinforcers. So it shouldn't be that reinforcers are just left out in grabbing distance of the pupil. As we said, we want to differentially reinforce responses. So correct responses, novel responses should obviously give access to higher reinforcement. And then incorrect responses should gain access to lesser preferred items. We always want to use a variety of reinforcers, and it's really important as well to follow your pupil's individualized variable ratio or their individualized reinforcement schedule. We also always want to pair social praise with tangible or edible reinforcement. Not It's important to say sorry, excuse me. It's important to say that not all pupils actually do have edible reinforcers, but and obviously only we would only give pupils edible reinforcers if it's been agreed with parents. Um, but it's important for us to pair social praise with tangible reinforcers because it's the hope that if we pair over a long period of time social praise with their most preferred items, that potentially the reinforcing quality of social praise itself will actually increase. So that's the end of our introduction to intensive trial teaching. We'll continue to go over the different elements of ITT that we weren't able to cover in this way in a workshop. So we'll be going through how to actually run the table session, role playing, error correction, and errorless teaching, as well as how to take the data in ITT.